Today, we're going to be speaking with Democratic Congressman Raja Krishnamoorthi, who represents the 8th District of Illinois. That's the western Chicago suburbs. He's chairman of the House Oversight Committee on Economic and Consumer Policy, also a member of the very important House Intelligence Committee. Congressman, it's great to have you on today.
Hey, thank you so much, David. Same here.
So, okay, to start, we spoke today about, for the first time in his presidency in the Real Clear Politics average, Joe Biden's approval has dipped just slightly below 40%. It's not great. It's lower than, at this point, even where Donald Trump was at this point in his presidency, and that was not good. I attribute this to sort of a lull in what we might call major accomplishments to point to. What do you think is driving these numbers, and what would you like to see the Biden administration do?
Well, I think that COVID, inflation, and probably the lack of progress on certain initiatives in Congress contribute to this. But obviously, as you know, elections are about choices. And I think that we're going to have some stark choices in the fall. But before then, we absolutely have to do better in Congress, but also hopefully we can see COVID decline and inflation come under some control.
Do you, as an individual who's up for re-election every 2 years, do you worry when the president's approval is low that it will affect your re-election?
Well, I think that the president's standing definitely affects how different elected officials and Democrats kind of fare because of the environment that the president's standing will influence. But I think at the end of the day, voters also try to balance local concerns and how they perceive their local elected officials' performance based on their own experiences, for instance, to assess, whether to support that person. And so I think the same will be true in this election. All that being said, we need to make sure that the president's successful. When he's successful, everyone's successful. But to do that, we have to make sure that we deliver for the American people and address their, everyday concerns right now.
When it comes to something like the Russia-Ukraine situation, I think that bad faith actors will criticize the president and Democrats no matter what is done, either as being weak or too strong or not being friendly enough, or whatever the case may be. Bad faith actors will have their criticisms. But what would you like to see the role of the Biden administration in the United States on the basis of what happens there in the next few months?
Well, actually, I think that the Biden administration has done a tremendous job of pulling together our allies onto the same page with regard to aggression on Ukrainian borders. I think that what we need to see at this point is more multilateral coordination with regard to what the costs Russia would face were to invade Ukraine. And that means agreeing on a very strong sanctions regime, agreeing on what we would do to support Ukraine if it is invaded. And of course, what do we do to give Russia an off-ramp with regard to the current crisis? If we can do those three things energetically and in a coordinated fashion, I think that hopefully we'll get to a better place. But right now, obviously, is a very dangerous moment.
What does your gut tell you? And you're on the House Intelligence Committee, but so your gut and what intelligence you've been presented, there may be some gray area there. But what does your gut tell you about the real objective here of Putin? Is this to suss out how people will react without a real plan to invade?
It's very interesting, and I had the privilege of attending a classified briefing with CIA Director Bill Burns, who's a tremendous public servant, by the way. We had this 2-hour conversation on Monday, and without getting into classified details, I think that what I can say for sure is that Putin has a very emotional connection to Ukraine in the sense that it's almost like a maniacal obsession with making sure Ukraine does not further kind of drift into the Western orbit. Interestingly, all of his actions since 2014, the invasion of Crimea, the presence of Russians in the Donbass, have further pushed Ukrainians into the embrace of Western countries. The second observation I have is that I do think that Putin, if he's just operating as a rational actor and setting aside his maniacal kind of personal obsession with Ukraine, knows that all things being equal, he doesn't want to have a situation where he invades and then has another Afghanistan on his hands, just as the Soviet Union did 30 years ago. And I think that because of that, I do think that there will be a search for diplomatic options that allow him to save face, even at the same time that he, kind of rattles the sabers. My hope is that his head prevails over his heart, and that we can kind of convince or persuade him that the costs would just be prohibitive for him. And, at the end of the day, he might want to have on his tombstone that he was the one who joined Ukraine to Russia. But the alternative could be just as plausible, which is he's the one that lost Ukraine. And so I think that's kind of the balance right now.
Is there a discussion amongst your colleagues about the possibility that in the sort of using the Ukraine-Russia situation as cover, that China may see an opportunity to escalate aggression with Taiwan? Is that a topic of consideration?
It is. I think there's two reasons why potentially Xi may not, the Chinese premier, Xi Jinping, may not move on Taiwan right now, which is, I don't think that China is prepared militarily to invade Taiwan. And my perception is that they don't think that they have enough of a military advantage over the United States in that region. That's my perception. That's how I feel. And then the second is he himself is trying to consolidate political power this year in China with the, I believe it's the Chinese People's Congress that's happening in September or October. And so he's also focused on making sure that he can bring all the elites along to basically rubber stamp his being in office for longer than perhaps any other premier in many years.
A couple of other things, and there's really so much to talk about. In terms of inflation, similarly to gas prices, where certainly a president can do a little bit on some of these issues, but really these are big structural systemic things that are often global in nature. What can be done about inflation? What should be done about inflation?
Well, I think it's a real issue, and you don't have to go further than your grocery store or your gas pump to see that it's a real issue, and anybody who doesn't think so is denying reality. I think there are three things that we as lawmakers and the Biden administration can do to tackle this. First is we have to fight COVID, and we have to make sure that we see a decline in cases here, but also abroad. So, David, in that regard, I'm going to put in a big plug for my legislation and my moves to really get the world vaccinated at this point, not just the United States, because if we see variant after variant come from abroad, including the Delta variant, which killed 3 of my distant relatives in India, and then the Omicron variant, and others come to our shores, it's going to wreak more havoc with our economy and lead to more inflation. So that's the first thing. We have to control COVID here and abroad. The second thing we have to do is, those infrastructure investments, which we approved in the fall, have to be directed at short-term logistical bottlenecks that kind of continue to hamper the supply chain. So just as an example, we should direct as much of that money as possible in the short term to modernizing our ports, to making sure that our rail facilities are modern and capable of handling the surge in goods that's happened now. having pop-up inland ports, and so forth. The third thing that we have to do is we have to call a spade and note that some companies are engaging in predatory pricing practices. On my committee, the House Oversight Subcommittee on Economic and Consumer Policy, which is a mouthful, we launched an investigation into the meat processing industry, where 4 firms control more than 60% of meat processing and have increased prices by double digits year after year, and are seeing net profits go through the roof. The same thing is happening in other industries. And so if we do those 3 things, I think it starts to help. But really what we need to do is make sure that we can take the disruptions out of the supply chain. That will be the biggest help at this point.
On to pick a couple of those things, I mean, on vaccinating the world, when you look at a world map right now, we're basically talking about Africa, where there's the serious lack of vaccines. I mean, even if, you look at South America, there's, in Eastern Europe, there's still fewer vaccine doses, but availability is increasing rapidly, really everywhere but Africa, as far as I understand, looking at the map. So is that the area that should be the focus?
I think that has to be among the top places that we direct our efforts. In Africa, it's still, I think, under 20% of the continent of 1.2 billion people are vaccinated. And I bet you, dollars to donuts, that the next variant, if it emerges, is going to be from a place like Africa. And what we fear is that the lethality of the next variant could far exceed Omicron and still have its contagiousness. And that's what we have to be really worried about. And I'm concerned that we have a real blind spot here, David, to this issue. And that's why I and Jeff Merkley and others are pushing very hard for the White House to direct more funds, much more funds in this direction, because it's really a modest investment compared to the price that we've paid to repair our economy and our healthcare system in other ways.
So what about domestically at this point? I mean, I have a feeling that due to political reasons, sometime between now and the State of the Union on March 1st, the White House will likely do some sort of a pseudo mission accomplished type transition to the endemic phase statement. And whether that's medically prudent is a question that remains to be seen. But, in Illinois, J.B. Pritzker has said it's going to be time to start winding down mask requirements. We're seeing it happen in California, New York, some places in schools. Does that make sense to you right now based on the data? What are the milestones we should be looking at otherwise?
It's an important question. I think that to some degree it makes sense to wind down some of these mandates, because at the end of the day, we are seeing a rapid decline in COVID cases. And I think there's a lot of public pressure as well to start to wind down some of those mandates. However, we have to be prudent about that, because especially in schools and other places where a lot of people are yet to be vaccinated or ineligible to be vaccinated, we just have to be cautious. And so I think that striking that balance is extremely important right now. But I think that at the end of the day, we have to stick to the science, David. We can't just wish this pandemic away. We're going to have to be very cautious, because look, we all want to keep the schools open. We all want to keep businesses open. We want the economy to stay open, and we cannot ever go into lockdown. So to prevent that, we have to take these very basic precautions, such as wearing masks, distancing, and so forth.
Okay, last thing I want to talk about. Nancy Pelosi in December said no to a congressional stock trading ban. In January, she said she's open to it, and now she's actually supporting it. Can you talk a little bit about your thoughts on the issue, but also the specifics of how such a ban might work, in the sense that a ban on making trades of individual stocks while in office is a very sort of narrow thing, and how this applies to significant others or family members, how this applies to mutual funds and other things? I mean, what would you like to see? What makes sense?
I think what I like to see is my bill become law. It's the Ban Conflicted Trading Act is the main bill that's being discussed right now. It has bicameral, bipartisan support, which is unusual for anything these days in Congress. And it's, I think, the subject of negotiations at this point. Basically, what it would do is this, David, which is what we know is that the Stock Act does not work. That is the act which basically requires disclosures of trading of individual stocks and securities, but doesn't prohibit it. What we found is that, according to a recent report, 54 members of Congress violated just those disclosure requirements, but hundreds of others followed those requirements, but have created a tremendous appearance of insider trading. Basically, people assume that when members of Congress pull out their Ameritrade app and start trading stocks, that they're doing so based on non-public information they gain from classified briefings and hearings and insight into legislation. So the consensus in the grassroots among Democrats and Republicans is the current system does not work. What my bill does is the following. It basically bans or prevents or prohibits members from trading individual stocks and securities, allows them to remain invested and to trade mutual funds and widely diversified funds. It also, if people wish to trade, they can do so through a blind trust. If they wish to keep their stocks, they can, but they can't trade them. They have to hold them for the time that they're in office. And at the end of the day, what we're trying to do, David, is we're trying to restore a little bit of trust back in Congress here. And when every story comes out saying that some member bought Pfizer stock because they got word that Pfizer just developed a vaccine, or sold Pfizer stock when they just got word that the pandemic is actually receding, that just creates the appearance that they're trading on insider information, and it erodes trust further. So we got to bring this to an end.
Now, would there be anything in this bill that would prevent Nancy Pelosi from saying to her husband, okay, you make these moves because this is what's going on? And would she be in compliance in that situation?
So technically, that would be a violation of the Stock Act if she were to do that. But if this particular bill applies to members and congressional staff, I'm definitely open to spouses being added, perhaps through an amendment to this particular bill. Right now, I just want to see the bill move, because I think we could sit here and basically have a situation where nothing gets done because people want the perfect bill. And really right now, what we want is a good bill, and we need it fast. And I'm really pleased that the grassroots and public pressure have brought us to this moment, along with mine and my colleagues' fierce advocacy in Congress. But we need reforms right now, David.
Yep, we're going to be watching that bill very, very closely. We've been speaking with Democratic Congressman Raja Krishnamoorthi, who represents the 8th District of Illinois. Really appreciate your time today.
Yes, sir. Thanks so much for having me.